In this video, I will take you on an exploration of a haunting photograph and its extremely disturbing backstory, dating back to September 12, 1916. It was a small mining town called Kingsport, Tennessee. The people living there began to pour out of their homes and assemble in the streets, because on that day, a traveling circus named Sparks' world-famous shows was coming to this small town. Now, the performance that was to take place in this traveling circus was a grand parade, and it was to end with a traditional circus act. This was going to be Kingsport's biggest and most exciting event yet, because Kingsport wasn't anything special. Most people lived in tents rather than houses, and the streets were mostly dirt, so the townsfolk were desperate for some kind of fun activity in their town. By around noon, everyone who could had gathered on the streets, and began to hear music from quite a distance. Then, from afar, clowns came into view. They were beating drums, blowing whistles, and there were acrobats too. There were dogs painted in bright colors and clowns standing on stilts. There were horses, lions, and trained sea lions. It was a proper, spectacular show, and the people of Kingsport were having the time of their lives. They were screaming and cheering in excitement, but the most exciting part of the parade was the elephants. There were 5 of them, and they walked at the very front of the procession. And each trailing elephant had also grasped the tail of the one in front with its trunk. They were marching in a line, and the one at the very front of these 5 elephants, it was the star of the show. This elephant's name was Mary, and the circus's owner Charles Park had advertised her as the largest land animal. She weighed over 5 tons, which is about 4,500 kilos, and Charlie had owned her since she was just a little calf. He taught her all kinds of big tricks. She could stand on her head, and she could play 25 different tunes on the drum. And she could even throw a baseball. Charlie loved her as if she were his own child. And Charlie knew that Mary was his ticket to success. At that time, there were many traveling circuses in America that he had to compete with. And generally, Charlie's circus was small in size, which was very frustrating and deeply disappointing for him personally. He kept coming up with new ways to expand the circus and make it more fun. But most of his efforts didn't work. But at least he had Mary, who effortlessly drew admiring crowds around her whenever she appeared. And when Mary walked the streets of Kingsport, whispers of wonder followed her. Everyone was utterly astonished by her. And all were jealous of the man riding on Mary's back, since he got the chance to sit up there. Her handler was a man named Red Adridge. When that parade finally ended, Charlie shifted his attention to the circus acts. Now Fred, who had served as Mary's devoted handler for several years, would carefully guide her along the bank to a nearby pond so she could quench her thirst. Fred, who was 38, was new to elephant handling. In fact, Charlie had hired him just a day before. When Charlie's show was passing through Virginia, Fred worked there as a janitor. He was set to handle all the animals in Charlie's show. They had been trained to care for the animals with great affection. Mary excelled at it, but Red was a somewhat hard-tempered fellow. He was the frail, red-haired guy most people used to tease, which is why he became so hot-headed. Anyway, as he and Mary were making their way toward the pond, Mary notices a watermelon on the ground, stops there, and begins eating it. As she does this, Fred observes a group of people starting to gather around them. The crowd had formed up, all because of Mary. Seeing this, Fred tries to lead Mary back toward the pond, so she can get a drink, but Mary won't listen. Her full focus is on the watermelon, and Red begins to feel a bit insecure. People think this animal isn't under my control, so he gets furious. And he grabs a metal rod fitted with a spike. He then jabs it into the fleshy area between Mary's ears. The pointed metal pierces right through her hide. Now Mary was an exceedingly gentle creature. But for the past 24 hours, ever since Red became her new handler, he had been abusing her in the same way. Then, when he stabbed her with that spiked rod, it was as if Mary's mind snapped and she erupted in rage. She swung around toward Red, and he froze in shock, looking at her in bewilderment, only to have Mary wrap her trunk around him. She hurled him into the air toward a nearby drink stand. At this point, the surrounding crowd, children and people from Kingsport, who had all come to see Mary, began screaming and scattering in panic. But Mary was not done with Red yet. She stood there, agitated, pacing back and forth and trumpeting, then turned and lifted her next 2 legs as she drew near Red. With all her might, she brought her foot down onto Red's skull. And just then, Charlie, hearing the commotion by the pond, ran over toward the scene. Mary was standing there in front of him, still trembling with fear, so he began to comfort her gently. Then he looked down and saw a red, mangled body. By this time, the townspeople had fled away in fear. They moved closer to see what Mary had done. Instead of being scared, people were angry, and they began shouting at Mary the elephant, "Murderer! Murderer!" Now for Charlie, this was the worst case scenario from a business perspective, since Mary was the star of his show, and she had just publicly killed her handler. A few hours later, news of Killer Mary spread throughout the town and even into neighboring towns. The news spread, and then a mob of enraged people arrived, stopping those who wanted to kill Mary. At one point, the Kingsport sheriff approached Mary and opened fire on her, because Mary was quite enormous. And its screen was quite tough, so bullets couldn't penetrate it. Moreover, the next town lay just a few hours after Red's death. To the town they were heading to with their circus, they sent a message saying, "We won't let you into our town if you bring Mary with you." Now Charlie realized that although Mary was the star of his show, if he didn't save his skin by parting with her, his business would collapse. He would be ruined financially, but he loved Mary very much. She was his oldest and most loyal partner, and he couldn't even imagine being without her. Yet Charlie was an ambitious man, and there were many people in his circus whose livelihoods depended on it. So on the night Red died, Charlie stayed awake all night, thinking about what to do, and the next morning a plan came to him. Charlie ordered his entire circus troupe, "Pack up all equipment immediately and head to the waiting train carriages. We're departing for the next town, Larvin." Then Charlie said, "We're going to put on a show there, the likes of which the whole world hasn't seen." Their world-famous spar show arrived in Larvin at around 10:30 a.m. Immediately all the performers began preparations for the big show, which would start with a parade, then the circus acts, and finally the grand finale. A huge crowd had already gathered even before their circus arrived, because Charlie had announced what he would do in his grand finale. Her news had spread throughout Larvin, and even to the surrounding towns, so everyone had come here from far and wide. By around midday, Charlie's entire team was ready. There was a parade then, but Mary wasn't part of it. Instead, she was chained at the very spot where the circus's main act would take place. When the parade ended, all eyes were on Mary for the circus performance. Her chains weren't removed, she just stood there, unsure what to do. She swayed to the music, swinging her trunk back and forth a time or two. In other words, she stood there confused as the circus's main act wrapped up and the performers filed back into their tent. And at this point, the crowd gathered here begins to surge onto the railway tracks. At the same time, Charlie and several animal handlers step forward to control the animals and prevent chaos. They manage to capture the other 4 elephants that had not been chained, then rush over to Mary and unlock her iron chains without hesitation. The handlers carefully line up all 5 massive elephants in a precise formation, each animal's trunk grasping the tail of the one in front, and then guide them toward the nearby railway tracks. And there's already a massive crowd gathered there, including the eager press whose cameras were fully prepared to capture every exciting moment of this grand finale. Charlie leads Mary and the other 4 elephants onto the railway tracks. Then he holds back the 4 elephants and has them removed with their handlers. He leaves Mary standing alone on the tracks. By now, Charlie had grown fond of Mary when a circus performer comes over, and he begins to tie Mary's hind legs to the railway tracks. Now Mary is fully trained, and Charlie is also taunting her. Of course, she was nervous as she was being tied up. She didn't struggle. And while all this was happening, a railway worker climbed into a machine. It's called a derrick, a specialized industrial type of crane designed to hoist exceptionally heavy loads, such as large pieces of timber, safely off the railway tracks. So the worker climbs into the derrick, which was positioned right over the track, and moves it behind Mary. Then when the derrick comes into place, and Mary is also secured to the track, then a second worker climbs onto the derrick, that front arm-like section of the machine. He grips the heavy iron chain hanging just within reach, then swiftly jumps down onto Mary's prone form, wrapping and desperately cinching the cold metal links firmly around her fragile neck. Then he dismounts from Mary. At this point, Charlie, who was still holding Mary and loving her for the last time, gives her a tight hug before moving over to stand in front of the crowd. By now the audience had fallen completely silent. They knew the grand finale was about to begin. When Charlie stands beside the crowd, he turns to look at Mary, the railroad worker. He signaled to the man sitting inside the derrick and he pulled the lever. At that point, only a single sound was audible. It was the chain that the derrick was slowly lifting. And as the chain rose, it pulled Mary upward by her neck. When the cold, heavy chain suddenly tightened cruelly around her trembling neck, she realized she couldn't go anywhere. Her feet were tightly bound to the fixed footplate, and she panicked. She turned quickly toward Charlie, waved her heavy grey trunk frantically, and let out desperate cries begging someone to help her. But sadly, no help came. Then, eventually, the heavy chain hanging high above grew so unnaturally tight that her front legs were suddenly lifted off the ground. Her hind legs were still on the ground. Then she looked at Charlie one last time and uttered a sound from her trunk. After that, her hind legs lifted as well, and she fell utterly silent. They left her hanging there until she died. Mary's public execution was the grand finale of Charlie's show. He had slain the enraged elephant that had actually killed his handler, to appease the cheering crowd and to save his struggling business, and it worked exactly as planned. For years afterward, his circus business grew even more because many people came, out of curiosity, to see his show and find out what he would do next. Because he had done that to Mary, Charlie was never the same afterward. He retired soon and died in 1944. Even today, Lurven, Tennessee is known as a town that hung the elephant.